the tsunami caused all the problems. The hurricane caused all the problems. It's like, did it? Because now these places can't bounce back.
Like, well, it's easy to talk about a hurricane in depersonalized terms. It's not our fault that the hurricane hit the Black community. I'm Ella.
And I'm Kieran. Welcome to Impolite Company, the podcast in which we bring our Black queer perspectives to some of the most interesting and pertinent DEI issues of the moment.
Join us as we laugh, cry and go deep on what topics are exciting us, as well as what's keeping us up at night.
Welcome back, everyone, to Impolite Company. Today, we're going to be talking about something that I've found really interesting recently, and maybe it's just I've not been exposed to it or it's not been marketed to me. But obviously, there's always an ongoing conversation around climate change and the impact it's having. I think more monolithically, usually when it's discussed, like how is it impacting the world and what do we all need to do to make things better? But something that I've noticed more recently is how there's more conversations around a more granular idea of how it's impacting specific groups, which I found really, really interesting. I think
it's almost more intersectional.
Exactly. The first one that I saw was around how it is specifically affecting women in the world. And then I've seen another one about how it affects kind of underrepresented or areas of the world that are less wealthy, have less access to resources, and how, a catastrophic event that's caused by climate change may impact people differently depending on where you are, the colour of your skin, unfortunately, and also within the Western world as well, like how it can be a different impact depending on what group you're a part of. So I guess the question that we have today is climate change racist? Ella?
Is climate change racist? Yes. But I think that we've deliberately asked a provocative question because, I think the average person, or the way that we've been conditioned to think about racism, as one example, is that it's a interpersonal, individual thing. And so actually, how could climate change possibly be racist? It affects the whole world. It is coming for us all. It involves natural. Well, I mean, you could argue not natural, but it involves natural disasters. It's the weather. It's the, it's the environment, but it's also man-made, and the way that it impacts communities is not kind of accidental.
Yeah.
And
it's not proportional.
Or proportional, exactly. And so I think there's loads of things to explore in this conversation, for the way that I talk about racism and think about racism and try and in some ways educate people about racism is to zoom out of the interpersonal, to zoom out of the, is Kieran racist? Well, Kieran's never said or done anything racist to me, so I don't think he's racist. And also, if I call him racist, that's me calling him a bad person. And I don't want to call this person a bad person. So it's such a insult to call someone racist. And if we personalize climate change in that way, then, I think people don't really know how to make the connection between something that they see as active interpersonal bigotry with something as kind of all-encompassing and non-individual, I suppose, as climate change. But if you think about racism as structural and systemic, and, it makes me think of, a few years ago when Monroe Bergdorf got a load of heat kind of before her resurgence in a way. Yeah.
The Piers Morgan.
The Piers Morgan gate got loads of heat for basically saying that white people were racist. And it was like, what? Yeah. I'm probably paraphrasing or what her intention is, but I've been seen her speak since then and that kind of thing, and my interpretation of what she was meaning and intending is to talk about racism and whiteness as a structure and as something that poisons everything. It's something that's in the water and something that white people can't escape. And I think when you think about race and racism as structural, as not necessarily just interpersonal, you can start to think about climate change and see it for what it is, which is deeply unequal by race and by other demographics as well. But
and you are able to kind of escape that visceral reaction. And I think that's what sometimes happens. It's like, well, I'm protesting for climate change for good. It's not racist.
Stop making everything about race.
It's like, well, no, it's just not as simple as how you're saying it. And actually, to ensure that we deal with climate change without causing other humanitarian disasters that are man-made, we need to ensure that we acknowledge that there is a difference. Similar to what we were talking about around feminism, right? Like, sometimes there's a want to not deal with the more complicated parts of feminism, which is if you're a black woman, your experience is different to a white woman. That conversation needs to be had. It's not interference. It's not getting in the way. It's part of the overall movement that you need to have that discussion to move forward.
Yes, it's like you need to apply an intersectional lens to your feminism. And one of the big critiques of environmentalism that I have seen from activists and environmental justice campaigners is almost similar to the critique of white feminism in a way of, you're flattening quite a diverse set of experiences in your activism and you're not taking into account the vastly unequal aims that we all have, and also the unequal impact. Climate change disproportionately impacts people in the global south, and they are the people who have contributed to it least. That's just a fact. Talking about climate change from the perspective of the global north, which is kind of solar panels and electric cars and a kind of naturistic lens, is not necessarily wrong, but I think it doesn't there's not enough, it seems like, from everything I've learned and read and engaged with so far, engagement with indigenous populations, with people from the global south, with communities that are most affected. And I think in some cases, communities who actually the biggest experts on what the solution might be. And
some of that knowledge may be locked in their culture.
Yes.
So talking of the global north versus global south, when we have events such as COP26, what are your feelings around, like, who's included in those conversations?
Well, I mean, from everything I've read, so COP28 is going on right now, literally as we're recording, and COP26 was a couple of years ago. So I guess in the height of COVID, I was reading that at COP26, there was a lack of vaccines and funding available for African countries, right? Which then meant that those delegates and those activists from those countries weren't then able to take part in the negotiations. So you have that's like a prime example of how vaccine availability was skewed towards countries in the global north to developed nations. And then the requirements for attending the climate conference were structured around whether or not people were vaccinated, delegates were vaccinated, and that automatically structurally then excluded countries who hadn't had the same vaccine availability from the discussions. And so they then didn't have a seat at the table. And it's worth remembering that a lot of those countries are African countries. And a lot of those countries are the most impacted by climate change and have the most urgent need for a solution. So, I think it's almost impossible to extract discussion of something like the climate crisis from these other discussions around white supremacy, around racism, around which countries have a voice at the kind of global table, around all of these kind of intersectional lenses. I think that climate change exacerbates, or it seems to me that exacerbates and highlights some of the structural issues that we have already, or that we have we've created over the last however many centuries.
It doesn't. It's not considered, and things aren't considered, right? It feels like it's skewed and designed. These types of events and conversations are skewed to the global north.
Yes, and our needs and our kind of the dragging of our heels, I think, because it's somewhat less urgent.
Yeah.
It's extremely urgent for everyone, but it does feel like, it hasn't quite, it's easy for the UK, for instance, to go, it hasn't quite hit us yet. We're not on any fault lines, and we don't tend to have hurricanes, and we're not reliant, we're not a broadly agricultural society that's reliant on, we don't have droughts. So there's a kind of heel dragging that we have the luxury of doing. I would say nobody has the luxury of doing that anymore, but in a way,
till it starts getting
because it doesn't feel exactly like it's hit us in the same ways that it's hit island nations, and it's hit African countries, and it's hit places like Puerto Rico, you know?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I also remember when I was in Jamaica, there was a conversation around, there was a load of vaccines donated to Jamaica, but they were close to expiry date and they couldn't mobilize them quickly enough. It's so annoying.
It's like, have these nearly off bananas. You're welcome.
And the thing that changed was efficacy, right? So it wasn't from the understanding was if it goes out of date, it still wouldn't be completely not effective. But obviously there was a load of conspiracy theories as well.
But it's just a kind of disdain to give almost expired vaccines to Jamaica.
Yeah.
Because of course.
Yeah. It's just wild. Why not give vaccines? They have less infrastructure to be able to mobilize and move these things across the country.
You weren't giving them to Germany.
Yeah. Why are you giving leftovers rather than, it's just, those kind of things. When we talk about structural racism as well, they're the kind of things we're talking about, right? Why was that seen as okay? Why couldn't those ones be used in like the UK? Yeah. And the ones that have a longer expiry date sent to places where it will take longer to mobilize them, and they could vaccinate more people over a longer period of time while they sort that out.
Because I think that we don't approach policies of this kind with pragmatism. We approach them with with white supremacy is in the water of how we think about those things. Who deserves, who matters, who deserves treatment, who deserves our care and attention. There's a deeply unequal way in which we think about the value of human life in countries with brown people, basically, versus countries that we see as civilized and enlightened and, Western Europe, basically.
Yeah, it's so true. And at that time, so I went towards they still had curfews for Jamaicans, which is a big thing when I was there. So essentially you've got the more touristic areas, specifically Negril was kind of treated differently to the rest of Jamaica.
During COVID,
and as they were coming out of COVID. So when I was there, there was curfews. I can't remember what the curfews were, but you had to be back in your house by a certain time. But in Negril, they were hosting festivals and people were flying in through these corridors, right? But then they had no restrictions and no curfews, but the local people had to be in their houses. There's so much other crazy things going on that obviously when this whole vaccine thing started happening as well, when they were like, they're going to run out, we can't mobilize them, people were then like, well, I don't want to take, why are we taking vaccines that are nearly running out anyway? I don't want to take those. I don't trust the government. You've got, festivals going on in the grill and we have to be in the house most of the day. Like, it was just I remember the environment was just like wild.
When we went to Jamaica, the experience was very much as well. There were no beaches that you could go on. There's no public beaches basically, and because they're all owned by like sandals resorts and just hotel complexes have bought up the beaches, and so you have a load of Americans on the beach with their wristband and in their all-inclusive hotel, basically not leaving the hotel the whole time because they've got everything they need. They've got, daily all-you-can-eat buffet, and they've got beautiful, pristine beach. Yeah. And just the concept that these private companies own the beach is wild. Like the concept of owning that part of the planet, that natural resource. So the way that Jamaica has been, socially, politically structured, the way that tourism has kind of ravaged Jamaica in many ways, I think is a tragedy.
It's a tragedy. And these decisions around the way that they treated COVID, on the face of it, may have not looked like a black and white issue in terms of like it disproportionately like impacting black people. But Negril is a tourist resort that has mainly a lot of white people go to, or people from other countries go to. When you're imposing different laws for a certain part of Jamaica, you can't just see it as a different part of Jamaica.
That's a perfect example of structural racism.
Exactly, it's a perfect example.
It's like the issue in America of having of redlining and having certain neighborhoods that black people just couldn't buy in.
Yeah.
It's not, the white people of those neighborhoods can go around and say, well, we're not racist, and our neighborhood isn't racist. We just don't happen to have any black people here. Yeah. It's the racism exists on the structural level. Yeah. And also the fact that it exists on the structural level gives you enough plausible deniability to say, that's not my problem. I can't do anything about that. If I saw a black person in the street, I'd be friendly to them. That's not,
That's not what we're talking about.
But that, that issue in Jamaica is a classic example of that. We're not going to say white people can stay out and black people have a curfew. We'll say Negril can stay out and the Kingston can't, or whatever.
And that's happening. That was happening all over the place. So when you even looked at during the lockdown, or as we were coming out of lockdown, all the prices to all the private beaches became really accessible to locals. Obviously, as soon as tourism started coming back, all those prices like tripled. So you imagine just the demographic, even from a class perspective, of people that were on that beach, like Margaritaville one day, the next day they were shocked. When we were going into one of them, I didn't really know what was going on at the time, but I spoke to my dad after and I was like, well, they were like, but we've got a family of 4, like we can't afford this. This is not what it was last week. And it's just like, wow, they're just iced out.
To go to the beach anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like paying to go to the park. It's like,
you're making money on drinks and food.
It should be public ownership in the first place.
Yeah.
How have you, just on a personal level, how have you, as a citizen of the global north, let's say, engaged with climate change until now? Like, how do you feel about it? How have you how have you engaged with it? Do you feel overwhelmed by it? I have lots of personal feelings on climate change, and as with most things I engage with, I have these mixed kind of feelings of understanding my privilege with the thing and also understanding the other side of my experience and the communities that I come from being affected.
I'm going to say closer proximity.
Yeah.
You have more likely have access to understanding how it has a direct impact on those communities. Yeah. So I think I'm similar. I definitely think that it needs to be something that we're all thinking about, but also very aware that not everybody can at the moment afford to think about it the same way. So I think, especially in the West, like, I've got an electric car, but that's not an accessible way to like contribute to maybe some of the change. But I do think that I want to do more to understand in more depth, directly what I can do to ensure it's not just about our country, it's about the world and the parts of the world that are going to be impacted first. So usually the ones that won't be able to rebuild or bounce back will be probably people that are our color and not white. And I think there's loads that can be done to understand that more. And that's something that I think I've not engaged. I've engaged with like the top level, the monolithic ideas of how we can all do much more. And actually you can easily be sold by that and you miss big chunks of what actually needs to be done. So I think I'm probably understand the privilege, understand that I can afford to make some of those changes, but also probably need to do a little bit more learning and the other things that we should be doing for other countries and more globally.
Yeah.
What can we be doing now to help those communities, or how can we use our privilege to help those communities? And if that means investing in Jamaica, if that means there's all these other things that I probably don't think of straight away.
Well, I suppose there's also the argument that actually you don't start with Jamaica, you start locally.
Yeah.
And the local interventions are, because there's also this something that I continue to try and keep challenging myself on, even internally, is my own kind of how the colonialist mindset almost impregnates my thinking as well.
Yeah.
And it's easy to kind of go, well,
throw money at it.
Yeah, but also should we have the mindset that we should help Jamaica, or should we actually, and by we I don't mean me and you, I'm talking larger than that, or should we actually just be bringing Jamaica to the fucking table and actually committing to doing what we should long have done in terms of reparations, in terms of taking accountability for our role as nations that have basically benefited from slavery, then from industrialization, then caused the climate crisis.
Yeah, I was going to say very much caused it.
then which has then had a disproportionate impact on those communities. And then it's easy, and then we go, oh, poor them. Should we help them? And it's maybe we need to do more structurally so that they can help themselves. And we acknowledge the damage we've done almost.
There's a part of me that's like, yes, I agree we should do that. And there's a lot of work for us as when we say we're talking about, what are we talking about? We're talking about the Western world, right?
I'm talking about the UK.
The UK. So there's work that we can do to change UK as in general, and what they're doing, and what, the things that should be acknowledged, and the reparations, all those kind of things. But then I feel there's also another thing around, as a Jamaican or as a Caribbean, how can I just directly do some, and I think
that's part of your,
I think there's both
lineage.
Yeah, so I think there's both that can happen at the same time. And I think actually by doing parts of the direct stuff, it kind of is funneling some of that money that would maybe go elsewhere, and money and talent and skills, and investing. When somewhere is invested and people see it as valuable, all of a sudden people care. I have a feeling say all of the diaspora of Jamaicans started investing in companies in Jamaica and investing in ensuring that the standard of living was higher for everybody in the Caribbean, etc. All of a sudden, and it became a viable economy, I think all of a sudden you'll see a difference of attitude with other nations.
Yeah, but I suppose it just relies on people of the Jamaican diaspora being able to afford to invest.
Yeah. We're seeing it in Ghana, right? We're seeing it in where people are literally, it's completely being seen as a viable, valuable place that has lots of opportunities. Jamaica isn't there, and a lot of Caribbean islands aren't quite there, and maybe don't have the resources, or I don't know. I just think it's interesting. I think those things can happen concurrently.
Yes.
America started when the British literally settled in the 17th century. In 1661, the parliament which I lead, it's the heinous slave code that spawned other slave codes here in the US, either directly mimicked or in part indirectly. And we feel that we have a moral obligation to be able to start to deconstruct the racism in all of its forms. It doesn't only come in laws that are still there, but it also comes in ways in which people undermine democracy, in ways in which people prevent people from voting, in ways in which people make judgments about people because of color or race. And we've got to work hard to deconstruct it. And we have to also recognize that when many countries became independent, there was no development compact or development package left for us, finance, education, healthcare, or any of these issues. But when the slaves were emancipated, 20 million pounds was paid to the slave owners. And then by reason of a 4-year apprenticeship scheme, another 27 million pounds of free labor was given. Now, if we were to take the example of Haiti, which is perhaps the most egregious example there is, where the French government took back from Haiti, and I think New York Times did an article recently.
Very powerful. Yeah,
that's right. So you know that even though Haiti declared independence, they then had to pay the French government for a significant period of time a portion of their customs duties. And yet Haiti today has never recovered. And we have to ask ourselves, can we accept that the Industrial Revolution was financed by the blood, sweat, and tears and money of developing countries, and at the same time causes the climate crisis today? And it's a case of double jeopardy. So we had the wealth taken from us, and now we are facing the consequences of that wealth's impact on the Earth's climate. It's wrong, just simply wrong.
I think that's a perfect encapsulation of, the answer to your original question, right?
Yeah.
Which is climate change racist? What does climate change have to do with race?
Mm-hmm.
The crisis that we're in now is a result of colonialism, slavery, the Industrial Revolution, and the havoc that has been wreaked on the world on the back of Black and brown people. And then on top of that, the people who experience the worst effects of it are Black and brown people.
Yeah. I think it's really easy for details to be like missed, right? Like it's easy to miss out parts around compensation, which are really important, right? When a country gets independence, the fact that there was just like no care package or development package to ensure that their chance of success was high, right? You have to just sort it out yourself. Yet when
not only sort it out yourself, we've acknowledged that we were wrong and that this was a wrong thing to do, and sorry about that, we'll stop doing it. But if you want us to stop doing it, you'll have to pay us compensation for our loss of earnings in stopping doing this heinous practice that we shouldn't have been doing in the first place.
So you're punished. You're punishing. You've admitted that what you were doing was wrong, but you're going to punish the other party for the things that you've admitted you were wrong and the reason why they're in that situation. You're going to punish them.
Yeah, and she gave the example of Haiti there.
It's outrageous.
But the UK taxpayers were still paying the compensation to the landowners and the slave owners until a couple of years ago. We were paying for that.
That is I think we've talked about it before, that the idea that in our taxes we were paying compensation.
Me and you, descendants of enslaved people, were paying the landowners of this country still for the first 25, 26 years of our lives, paying them compensation for what they did to our ancestors.
I mean, people complain about being taxed double tax. I mean, try and comprehend that.
Wild.
Several generations. It's insane.
Absolutely wild. So I think you cannot disentangle this question, which is, the question of the crisis, the biggest crisis facing humankind. This is a quote from a UN article, which talks about how climate change, which intersects with inequalities for women and girls, and also talks about, and what it's talking about mostly in this article is how not only is a climate crisis not neutral in terms of ethnicity and race, it's also not neutral in terms of gender, because women and girls experience the greatest impacts of climate change, partly because they have less access to natural resources but depend more on them, because in lots of regions women bear a disproportionate responsibility for securing food, water and fuel. Agriculture is the most important employment sector for women in low and lower middle income countries. So there's all of this kind of gender.
Yeah.
There's an intersection here as well in terms of gender. And, I think that one of the powerful quotes in this article is, if you're invisible in everyday life, your needs will not be thought of, let alone addressed in a crisis situation.
Which is really, really like, obviously when you hear that, you're like, of course.
Yeah.
But it's just something you not think about. And another part of this actually article is around like humanitarian programs tend to be heteronormative and can reinforce the patriarchal structure of society if they do not take into account sexual and gender diversity. So when those things happen, the bounce back is not quite facilitated for people that don't fit into heteronormative or any.
And we've seen that the responses, in a crisis situation, what happens to communities that are otherwise invisible. We saw what happened after Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
Back when Kanye was admitting that that US presidents don't care about black people.
Yeah. Trans people were turned away from emergency shelters in Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah. And you saw what happened in Puerto Rico more recently. Yeah. I can't remember what storm that was or what hurricane that was, like Irma or something.
Yeah.
But you see in the response the lack of care and the lack of, you have countries that already, or regions or areas that already don't have the infrastructure that get hit most hard, and then also have a woeful response from the government or from,
Yeah, and it's often the actions after kind of a humanitarian event that really demonstrate how deeply troubling and linked these things are, like how racism is. So it was a Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico.
Hurricane Maria.
Yeah. So the rebuilding, so it's really, in this article, they talk about it being really interesting how what happens to the land after people have been displaced, and how land speculation and land grabs and investments are made in communities that, when there were black people living there, had endured not having the things people needed to have livable, good lives. So suddenly it's seen as an opportunity to land grab and have these, which is like insane. And before they were struggling to get any kind of investment for people to have basic amenities or a basic good standard of living. It's really sad. It's really, it's just, what the fuck?
I think sometimes I just feel quite overwhelmed with how fucked up everything is. But one other thing I thought, I read a fantastic conversation with an activist called Elizabeth Yompierre.
Yeah.
I hope I have pronounced that correctly. And she just says she's a climate justice activist.
Yeah. And
she talks about the distinction between environmentalism and climate justice, which I think we should cover.
Yeah.
But in talking about climate change and its kind of interwovenness with racial justice issues, she talks about how actually she started as a racial justice activist and moved into climate activism and sees them as part and parcel of the same fight almost. And I thought this was a really interesting perspective. She says, for us as part of the climate justice movement, to separate those things is impossible. The truth is that the climate justice movement, people of color, indigenous people have always worked multidimensionally, which you and I both know, because we've had to be able to fight on so many different planes. When I first came into this work, I was fighting police brutality at the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund. We were fighting for racial justice. We were in our 20s and this is how it started. It was only a few years after that I realized if we couldn't breathe, we couldn't fight for justice. And that's how I got into the environmental justice movement. For us, there is no distinction between one and the other. And then she goes on to say, and I think this is a really insightful link, in our communities, people are suffering from asthma and upper respiratory disease, and we've been fighting for the right to breathe for generations. It's ironic that those are the signs you're seeing in these protests. I can't breathe. When the police are using chokeholds, literally people who suffer from a history of asthma and respiratory disease, their breath is taken away. When Eric Garner died and we heard that he had asthma, the first thing we said in my house was, this is an environmental justice issue.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yeah.
So there's just kind of like multi-dimensional links between all of these issues. You have the question of the origins of the crisis we're in being rooted in white supremacy, being rooted in colonialism. You have the effects then disproportionately affecting the people who on whose backs this was created, but who have contributed the least and benefited the least
and been neglected
from that industrialization, from capitalism. And then you have the continual layering of those injustices in how society is structured. We've talked quite a bit about global north versus global south so far, but even within countries like the UK, the US, you then have this disproportionality in terms of who's most affected and who's most neglected.
Yeah, like when you think about Hurricane Katrina, kind of, was there ever a focus on the historical circumstances that made this such a devastating event? Like, did we ever talk about like the legacy of neglect and racism, which is, something that meant that there was not the ability to be resilient for when something like that happens? It's just not there because the infrastructure was never there, never invested in. There's all these things that play a part into why that was such a devastating event, not just the actual natural event that happened. I don't think there's been really much conversations about that, and that's what's really nice about this interview with Elizabeth is she's really good at connecting those dots and making you think about those things. But I don't think that's a discourse that happens when these things happen. It's always about the event, and the event caused all the problems.
Yeah,
the tsunami caused all the problems. The hurricane caused all the problems. It's like, did it? Because now these places can't bounce back.
It's easy to talk about a hurricane in depersonalized terms. It's not our fault that the hurricane hit the Black community. It's easy to kind of depersonalize that. But to your point, the kind of conversations I'm constantly trying to have with people about racism is to get them to zoom out, to zoom out further from not only the interpersonal to the kind of societal and the structural, but to zoom out historically as well. I think it's easy to say, oh, climate change, that's been an issue since the 60s, 70s, when we should really have been thinking about it. But it's the long arm of history is longer than that. If you think about the fact that this began with the stealing of people's land, the chopping down of trees, the pillaging of indigenous land. So disruption and genocide of indigenous peoples, then enslavement of people captured kidnapped from Africa, then industrialization, the burning of coal, the Industrial Revolution, which made loads of people rich, not the people on whose backs it was created. This didn't start 50 years ago. And so I think that's an important thing that we must do with all interrogation of all kind of societal issues, is do more zooming out from the kind of immediate. And that also means thinking less about, well, do I recycle?
I think that's something that society finds really hard to do. And actually, I talk about, I work in UX, and we always talk about zooming in and out, right? What is the bigger? What's the micro problem? What's the meta problem? Like, we're always zooming in and out. It's something that is naturally something that we do at work. And probably in tech quite a lot, you zoom in and out, but even in tech. But I do think that society in general is more primed to hyper localizing, or actually not localizing, they detaching things from each other because it's easier to comprehend. I think that's something that the society needs to get better at not doing, of like going exactly what you said. Let's look at the history. Why is this impacting certain people in a certain way? Let's acknowledge that. Let's acknowledge it so that we can help resolve it. At the end of Elizabeth's article, she talks about that groups of white young people have contacted her and asked how they can support. And she was like, yeah, how can they best use their resources and skills to support what she's doing? And they said, you know what, this is the right question. Let's do this together, and let's not pretend that things didn't happen. Otherwise, we're not going to get to the place we all want to get to. I found that really interesting of like, actually, there's some respect there of you've acknowledged that we may need your help. You've acknowledged that you have resources that we may not have access to and more power. How can I use my power to help and acknowledge, you know? And I think that's really interesting. And that's where I think we need to get to as a society.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's hard because like, I was just thinking like a really small example from me is a lot of the hurricanes that go through the Caribbean also go through Florida, right? And go through some of those states. You don't see the same level of devastation as the same hurricane a lot of the time at the same magnitude.
Well,
got theme parks in Florida with like the tallest roller coasters in the world.
Well, it's in that interview with Mia Motley, actually before the clip that we played, she talks about how the country in the world that experiences hurricanes every single year is the United States. That's the place that gets actually
the hurricane capital, right?
Worst hit by hurricane. It's different states, but it's the US is the most affected by those extreme weather events than any other country. But yeah, I mean, I think even within, you know, so-called developed nations, so you have this kind of the way that the climate crisis impacts developing nations and nations that don't necessarily have the same resources, the same infrastructure, don't have the same voice at the UN or at the kind of various COP conferences and that kind of thing. And then you also have this legacy. I mean, there are some really prominent American examples, but you have this legacy of even within developed nations like the US, Black communities being then punished within those countries from a climate perspective. We've talked about Hurricane Katrina, but also surveys of waste sites show that people of color are often exposed to higher levels of pollution. This is in the US, raising the possibility of a connection between race and environmental harm. You know, if you think about one big example is the Flint water crisis. So Flint is a town in Michigan, and we can talk about the Flint water crisis as past tense in a way, but in some ways it's still kind of ongoing. So basically from 2014 until around 2020, Flint had a crisis going on in the fact that high levels of lead were found in the water. The water was undrinkable. It was, you know, there were videos online of people turning on their taps and the water was brown. And this crisis, which was basically due to aging pipes and them not being dealt with, led to deaths. It led to thousands of children being exposed to high levels of lead, which can also create loads of issues with development, with intellectual functioning, with Alzheimer's down the line. And a state of emergency was called in 2016. And basically this problem of the pipes being replaced, etc., was not solved in any meaningful way for 6 years. And so, you know, you have a developed nation, the USA, supposedly, you know, the American president would say the greatest country in the world, right? Certainly one of the richest countries in the world, with a whole population of people who have no access to what we would consider a very basic human right, which is clean drinking water. And, you know, how does this intersect with other structural issues like race? Well, you know, Flint's population is 54% Black compared with the wider state's overall population, which is 14% Black. So this is a disproportionately Black issue. And there was why was there never an importance to have replaced those pipes in the first place before it got to this point? Exactly that. So you see how issues that are, it's an area that hasn't been invested in.
Yeah.
Arguably because it's a black area, right?
Yeah.
Why did it get to this point in the first place? And then once the crisis hits, the speed and the intensity with which it's dealt with is disproportionately slower. And there was a medical center, Hurley Medical Center study on Flint in 2015. So this was only a year or so into the crisis, and 24% of the children outside of Flint were African American, while 76.8% of the children in areas with high water lead levels were African American. So, 76.8% of the children in the areas that had high lead levels in the water were African American. So, they found that not only did race, but socioeconomic status represented a meaningful difference, with children inside of Flint being more disadvantaged than those children who lived outside of Flint. And now you have this, apparently, according to Wikipedia, the water crisis is solved. The water, the pipes have all been replaced. The water is safe to drink in Flint now. And also there's a compensation scheme happening for residents of Flint. So on paper, resolved, but now you have this legacy, and this is something we've touched on in another episode as well. You then have this legacy which builds on earlier legacies within certain communities of not trusting institutions and structures and government, because all through this crisis it was mishandled, badly handled. At one point they said the water was safe and it wasn't safe, and so you have this just compounds the level of mistrust within certain communities. And how deeply that's going to impact us if we have another COVID down the road, if we have another pandemic, because we already have that legacy of mistrust, in the black community, for instance.
And if that mistrust is there, are you then having to pay more to feel like you have a decent basic right to what you consider acceptable water, which is buying bottled water? You then have a cost that other people might not have, because
people in Flint are still buying bottled water.
Yeah, of course they are.
Yeah, because
and the other thing that I find quite interesting as well is there's a question around if the remedial work or replacement work to pipes across the whole state was even, would the levels of lead have reached that dangerous point as a state? So they may, from a broader statistic, it might have always looked like they were below the I think parts per billion for lead levels, because you're hiding that it's concentrated in one part of your state
area.
Whereas if that was spread out across the whole state, not only would it be the same percentage, but also not dangerous for everyone.
Yeah.
There's things like that where you're just like, that's a no-brainer.
Yeah. Yeah. It's absolutely appalling that it's ever have gotten to that level, and that it wasn't, and that it took, half a decade
to resolve.
There's a girl called Little Miss Flint who posts about it and has almost become an activist. And, she's now 16, and she has spent a proportion of her life raising awareness about the Flint water crisis and fundraising to support underprivileged children in her community. She started this when she was 8 years old by writing a letter to Barack Obama in order to draw attention to the water crisis in Flint. She's now 16. She spent half her life campaigning for clean water, and she's a child. And that's happening in America. I just think it's such a pertinent example of how the kind of many layered structural issue that this is,
Yeah, and I think the another example of that is around where you have marginalised communities as well that again are disproportionately impacted. So this all comes back to, I think a lot of this comes back to, say, if it was compounded with a disaster, Flint would not have the same level of health, right? Because of the situation that they're in, which means they would need more support, or probably would have the support that they would need. It'll be more complex. It adds another layer of complexity. And you see a kind of a similar thing with kind of LGBTQ plus people, right? And in terms of there's a disproportionate amount of LGBTQ plus people that are homeless for various reasons. A lot of the time running away from either conflicts at home, running away from the environment that they're in, and they're forced out of their house. And I think the LGBTQ plus community, although only 9.5% of US youth identify as LGBTQ plus, they make up about 40% of homeless youth, which is a really high proportion, right?
Yeah.
It's crazy. So again, what does that mean when you're homeless? There's a bunch of things that you're exposed to. There's a bunch of things that your health is not going to be in the greatest place, right? Mm-hmm. And I think if you overlay that with a humanitarian crisis, homeless people are going to be impacted in general more. And if 40% of youth are LGBTQ plus, that's impacting a lot of LGBTQ plus people, right?
Yeah. And
then if on top of that, you're layering that most of the support after those crises, or just in general, are positioned to be more heteronormative, that can't facilitate the needs of those people, that it's just compounds.
Yeah.
It's overly complex.
Yeah. It puts fuel on the fire of the displacement.
Yeah.
And the struggles that they were already experiencing. Yeah. It just multiplies.
I think some would say, and from the kind of environmental movement, climate change movement, I don't know, would say that is the big ticket items and the bigger things are more important to focus on rather than the hyper local. What would be your response to that?
I suppose it depends what we mean by big ticket item. I think it's and both.
Yeah.
I think that what can happen if we just focus on a kind of grand global scale is what one of the kind of key critiques of the mainstream environmental movement is that we leave out local communities, indigenous communities, people who are doing great things on a local level from the conversation. And also we flatten some of the specificity of what needs to happen. And potentially there's a kind of get out that countries have, which is why people, like Greta Thunberg thinks COP28 is a waste of time. And I can totally see why. We have these nations coming together every year to chat about phasing out fossil fuels, maybe phasing out fossil fuels. One of the big debates at the moment currently in COP28 is whether they're going to use the language of phase out or not. And even the concept of phasing out fossil fuels has only been on the agenda for the past couple of COP conferences. When you consider that it's been going on for 25 years or something, it's a joke. So I can totally see how people are disillusioned with the concept of nations coming together and chatting about this stuff and not really meaningfully doing anything. I mean, it's an absolute, it's borderline laughable that the current conference is being held in Dubai and the president is the head of an oil company. I mean, it's just absolutely nuts. So, I think that kind of level of conversation can often be a way for people to chat about stuff and not really do very much. Yeah. And that, local communities, I'm a big believer in, if you can move your local community, for instance, onto renewable energy and everyone benefits from that, you have kind of a virtuous cycle of local people really caring about going renewable and seeing the benefits of that, and seeing the benefits not only from an environmental perspective, but to their pocket and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that stuff does snowball out. So I'm a big believer in approaching things in that way. And at the same time, countries need to solve this problem because one of the big, I think, tragedies of the narrative around environmentalism has been that people can solve it on an individual level in a way. And that absolves big corporations, it absolves governments from actually doing what they need to do. I mean, I can rinse out yogurt pots as much as I want.
And we do know that there was...
I don't have a private jet.
But there was also a big scandal of it all just going to just like lots of like donated clothes and recycling being processed in countries in Africa.
Yeah.
And then it actually not happening because of all other reasons, right?
Yeah,
And
I read a thing. Hang on, I'll find it.
Ended up in the sea. Like all these big, massive, like recycled sea plastic bag things.
Yeah, exactly. And I read, okay, get this statistic, right? Private jets belonging to 200 celebrities, CEOs, oligarchs, and billionaires have spent a combined total of 11 years in the air since the start of 2022. This is an article that was published on the 21st of November this year. So, over the past nearly 2 years, The Guardian has used public data to track flights by private aircraft owned by celebrities and business people, blah, 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 right? The Rolling Stones, this was unbelievable. I read it and I was like, ugh, the fuckers. Taylor Swift has dropped hers because she faced backlash. Among the most polluting jets was a Boeing 767 wide-body aircraft used by the Rolling Stones.
Stop that.
It emitted an estimated 5,046 tons of CO2, the equivalent of someone taking 1,763 return flights from London to New York. Right? There's fuck all I can do when the Rolling Stones are just flying from London to New York every second, basically.
That is wild.
And what happens with private jets as well is most of the time they're unmanned because they're going to pick people up.
Yep. Well, yeah, I know.
Got nobody in them.
Yeah, so I know a friend of a friend that's an air steward for a private jet, and a lot of the time he spends flying to the place where they're picking someone up.
Right. So I also do think it's and both, because I think that there's real genuine value in the local, and also the local that involves and includes people, indigenous people local to the community, people who are already doing the work, all of that stuff. And also sometimes I feel a bit overwhelmed by the fact that what responsibility do I and can I have on an individual level when people are literally torching, that a very, very small percentage of people in the world are absolutely torching the planet and
justifying it somehow.
And I'm not one of, I'm kind of close-ish by the virtue of the fact that I live in the country that I live in.
Yeah.
And I've been on flights, but like in the grand scheme of things, I get frustrated with the fact that it's like this 10% of people that need to fucking stop.
Yeah. It's always the case, right?
Yeah. And I think that, again, Elizabeth Yeampierre gives a really good example of what she sees as kind of environmental justice and the approach to environmentalism that she takes. And I think it gives a great kind of blueprint of how we can think about this.
Yeah.
So she says, so a New York City example is they've been talking about bringing in offshore wind. And one of the things that she says that they've learned that is, in order for that to happen, the pieces have to come from Europe and be assembled in New York. And then they would be coming in these huge container ships. Yeah. And these container ships operate on diesel. And so what happens is they then park themselves on the waterfront of an environmental justice community, and the climate solution becomes an environmental justice problem. So the climate solution is we reduce carbon, but the environmental justice problem is we dump tons of nitrogen oxide and sulfur oxide into the lungs of the host community. And so this is one of these classic dichotomies of the wider environmental movement. We see that kind of thing with electric cars, right? It's like move to electric cars, but also the mining
exactly.
of the lithium needed for the batteries is fucking over all these local communities.
The amount of energy to renew those batteries or to,
there's, it's like, and so she says, these are the kinds of things that we think about when we're thinking about what she calls a just transition.
Yeah.
So she says, a climate activist will say, okay, we need offshore wind. And that's the extent of the way they'll think about
top level.
it. But a climate justice activist will be like, okay, let's look at it a little closer and let's figure out what the process looks like, how we can engage in remediation to make sure we're not only reducing carbon, but also reducing co-pollutants. And let's make sure that the people that are hired locally. So there are all of these pieces that are involved in a just transition. Climate activists talk about moving a grand scale.
Yeah.
And she says they talk about moving at a local scale and then replicating those efforts. So I think that's almost a direct answer to your question.
Yeah. And I think you do need both, right? But they both have to acknowledge the value that they're both bringing to that conversation and not ice each other out.
The problem as well with the grand thinking is that it often in its grand thinking causes more harm than good.
Yeah.
Because
if you don't acknowledge the other stuff, right? And if you don't take that into consideration.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
And I think that's the same case with what I was saying about the recycled stuff, right? It's like grand scale, the country needs to do more recycling. But if you don't look at the details of like, okay, then how do we process all of that recycling? It gets offshored and ends up in a landfill in Africa. Yeah. It's like, you've not thought about this. Is not, you need that more granular.
We all pat ourselves on the back and say, I reuse my plastic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Is climate change racist, Kieran?
Is climate? I think that it's clumsy. I think that
what's clumsy?
Like the conversation around climate change is very clumsy, especially, when we're talking about the bigger thinking that doesn't take into consideration the more granular things that we need to do to actually execute this in a way that doesn't have the opposite effect of what you're trying to achieve, or doesn't have an impact on. I think if you were to ask most people that were advocates for climate change, which I think most people are, they also would be advocates for like basic human rights and humanitarian advocates. And I think it's really important to balance, be thinking about both those things at the same time. I know it can be really hard and really complicated, but what we've talked about in terms of race as well, we've talked about the fact that if you oversimplify things and try and sensationalize stuff, the message can get lost, and the real impact of what you're advocating may not be acknowledged or understood. So I think for me, it's clumsy. In parts, it is racist from a structural perspective, and I think that there is a lot to do in terms of making sure that we are bringing the voices of all the people that will be impacted and having that kind of that be part of the narrative.
I agree. I think that my belief is that the structural inequalities that we have in society, whether ableism, white supremacy is arguably the umbrella one, that some of these other things are kind of sub effects of white supremacy in a way, but white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, like all of these things are connected, and I think the climate crisis is no different. It's a product of, and the kind of parent of some of these things at the same time. It causes and is caused by some of these other structural issues, and kind of exacerbates and snowballs some of these other issues. And I think in the conversation about it, to try and have the conversation about it without bringing those parts in, bringing the intersectional lens in, is a mistake, as it's a mistake 100%. When we talk about feminism, for instance. I think the same principles of how we think about the problem apply.
Yeah. It's also one of those topics that I think until you start looking into it, how much you realize, because we suggested climate change and how it affects people, just in general, different types of people, different communities, different countries. And I think when you start looking into it, you're like, Jesus, like it's really something that's not really spoken about in detail. And maybe we need to do another podcast, but it's so far reaching, it affects everyone. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you in the next podcast. Give us 5 stars.
Yeah, you bastard.
We need 5 stars.
Give us 5 stars, yeah. Thank you for listening to this episode of Impolite Company.
If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to our show and share it far and wide with anyone you think will benefit.
And if you'd like to connect with us directly, we're on LinkedIn as Kieran Scott Woodhouse and Ella McCann Tomlin.
We'll be back soon.